Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome back to our online lecturing system. I hope you are enjoying the system so far and that you have more time to study, free read, relax, and do whatever you like. Okay, so in today's lecture, we are going to continue talking about the famous games used in experimental economics. In the previous lecture, we talked about the first of these famous games, which was the public good game. And we saw how this public good game was used to measure the cooperative behavior of individuals versus the free riding behavior, and how using different behavioral interventions like the ones discussed in the presentation by Mazen could encourage people to cooperate more. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about the second famous game in experimental economics, which is the trust game. So what is the trust game? As the name indicates, the trust game is a game that is trying to measure the level of trust between individuals in any society. Okay, so why is trust important? Or what do we mean by trust? Actually, human societies are unique in the extent to which trust characterizes their interpersonal interactions. Okay, so trust is an important ingredient in many of the interpersonal interactions between individuals in any society. So let's look, for example, at friendships. Okay, friendships are always based on trust. Marriages, a very important building block in any marriage is trust between the people who are going to get married. Families, there is a high level of trust between family members, and organizations as well. Organizations should be based on trust. Why? Why is it important for organizations to be based on trust? If you remember the theory that you studied before on the principal-agent problem, okay, let's recall it very quickly. So this principal-agent problem occurs when one person, who is the agent, is allowed to make decisions on behalf of another person who is the principal. In this case, there will be issues of adverse selection, okay, which might occur, that I might choose the wrong person to manage my decisions. There could be moral hazard, okay. There could be conflict of interest between the agent and the principal. There are many examples that clarify this principal-agent problem, like politicians who are the agents and voters the principals. Okay, this is a very important example of the principal-agent problem. So when voters vote for politicians, voters are the principals and politicians in this case are the agents who should be abiding by the mandates upon which the voters voted for them. Okay, so this is a very good example of a principal-agent problem. Another economic example of a principal-agent problem is the example of shareholders versus managers. Shareholders in this case are the principals, okay, of any company, and managers are the agents who will be taking decisions on behalf of the principals, on behalf of the shareholders, okay. Managers and workers is another example of a principal-agent problem, okay, where managers are the principals and workers are the agents who should be working efficiently in order to increase the profits of the firm, okay. So all these examples, in all these examples, trust should be a very important ingredient. So when we saw in the previous slide how trust is a main ingredient in many of the interactions between individuals. So why is it than important. Why the existence of trust in any society important? Trust is important because if trust exists in any society, transaction costs will be reduced. If you remember what we mean by transaction costs are any costs associated with any economic transaction. So let's take, for example, a transaction where an individual is going to buy a car from someone else or is going to buy an apartment from someone else. If this person trusts the laws in this country, if he trusts the court system in this country, this will definitely lead to a huge reduction in the transaction costs. He does not have to go and hire a lawyer before conducting this transaction, for example. Okay, so if trust exists, many transaction costs will be reduced and people will have more time to devote to working, which will result in higher productivity. Okay, instead of looking for measures that they should take in order to make sure that no one will like default on the contract or things like that. Thus, trust is a lubricant or a facilitator of all economic transactions, all political exchanges and social exchanges. If, for example, let's take a political example. As we said, this relationship between the voters and the politicians, the voters and the MPs, the members of parliament, this is an example of a principal agent problem. So if voters trust that politicians or MPs are going to abide by their mandates, this will definitely lead to positive effect on the relationship between voters and politicians. Consequently, all these things will consequently have a positive impact on economic growth, as we will see in 2 slides from now. So we saw how trust is an important factor in almost all human interactions. We also saw how it is an important factor to economic growth because it leads to huge reductions in transaction costs. Okay. However, it should be clear that whenever we trust, there is also the possibility of trust betrayal. We should be aware that whenever we trust each other, there could be a possibility or a probability that others betray our trust. However, despite the fact that most humans have experienced instances of breach of trust, they still remain capable of trusting others. Okay? That's why it is very important for us to try to measure the level of trust among individuals, among Egyptians, for example, and examine the different interventions that could result in higher levels of trust, the different interventions that could result in lower levels of trust, okay, in order to reach policy implications about this. And that's why after understanding the trust game that is used in experimental economics, we are going to send you an application for a real experiment that was conducted in FEPS that was trying to measure the level of trust among FEPSians and the different interventions that we used in order to check whether they will increase or decrease the level of trust. So understanding the importance and the significance of trust from an economic perspective, a political perspective, and even a social perspective, it proved to be very important to measure the level of trust among individuals in different countries. So how is trust measured? Actually, there are two methods by which economists try to measure trust between individuals. The first method is based on surveys, okay? The second one is based on experiments. We're going to start with the first one, which is survey-based measures of trust. I will start with the survey-based measures of trust. So according to different surveys, like the World Values Survey, for example, there is also the Arab Barometer, which is another version of surveys between Arab countries, okay? These surveys try to measure the level of trust among individuals in different countries. Why? Why is it important? Because for the reasons we mentioned before, for the economic, political, and social importance of trust, okay? Trust is also forming an important concept, which is social capital. What is social capital? If you know, capital in any country is normally the machines, the equipment, the plants, المصانع. All these are capital in any country. We also have human capital. If you remember when we studied in economic development, human capital, رأس المال البشري, it was based on the level of education and health of the labor force, okay? So what is social capital? Social capital, or رأس المال الاجتماعي, this refers to the level of trust and cooperation between the members of any society. And this is another form of capital. So whenever the level of trust between individuals in any society is high, whenever the level of cooperation is high, this represents another form of capital for the country. That, of course, has positive implication on its GDP and has positive political implications and so on. Okay, so how do surveys try to measure the level of trust between individuals? Surveys use a special form of a question, okay, in order to try to measure the level of trust between individuals. This question you can see in this table. So the question is as follows. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted, or that you cannot be too careful in dealing with people? This is the question that tries to measure the level of trust between individuals, okay? So the answer is either most people can be trusted. You can either choose this option, that most people can be trusted, or you can choose the option that you cannot be too careful when dealing with people, which means that you should be cautious in dealing with people, which is a reflection of a very low level of trust, okay? And as you can see, this table is a summary of responses from more than 56,000 individuals surveyed in 45 countries, okay, from 1990 to 1993. So across this wave of the World Values Survey, okay? So as you can see, 65% of the people surveyed in this wave, okay, showed low levels of trust. And 34% said that most people can be trusted, okay, which is very dangerous. This means that the majority of individuals do not trust each other, okay? And we can definitely look at each country separately, but this is in general, okay? The majority of people surveyed in the World Values Survey, which is Egypt is one of these countries that report answers to the World Values Survey. So Egypt is one of these countries, or Egyptians are part of the 56,000 individuals surveyed. Okay. Another question that is also related to the trust. However, it looks at the different categories. So how much do you trust various groups of people, like your family, your own nationals, your government, certain institutions, religious institutions, and so on, okay? But we are now interested in the first question, which is the level of trust between individuals. And this result is very dangerous because it means that most individuals do not trust each other, which has, as we previously mentioned, would have negative economic, political, and social implications. Using this World Value Survey data, Whitley 2000, okay, tried to draw a descriptive analysis out of this data. So he drew this figure that you can see, where on the x-axis there is the percentage of trusting people, okay, and on the y-axis there is the GDP per capita in 1992 for the countries that were surveyed in the World Value Survey. And as you can see from these scattered plot, okay, there looks like a positive relationship between the GDP per capita and the level of trust. So the higher the percentage of people who trust each other, the higher the GDP per capita in the country, okay, which is of course because of the reasons that we mentioned before, like the reduction in the transaction costs, which will make people focus more on working, on productivity, and not wasting a lot of time on trying to enforce contracts and so on. Okay. In addition to this descriptive analysis, a regression analysis was also conducted, and it also showed that trust in a country is related to its economic growth. So the higher the level of trust in a country, the higher the economic growth in this country, which confirms the importance and the significance of trust from at least an economic perspective. Okay, so the second method by which people can get data on measures of trust or the level of trust between individuals is based on experiments, on economic experiments. So why is an economic experiment a better method than surveys? This is for the reasons we mentioned before, because we said that surveys, they reflect or they try to measure attitude, not behavior. Where the responders in a survey like might try to answer in a way that will please the person who's asking them the question, for example, which we call social desirability. Another problem of surveys is that you cannot control all the other factors that might affect the answer of the individual. There are many confounders, there are many other factors that might contaminate the results and which are outside our control. That's why experiments prove to be a better method for trying to measure trust, because as you will see, in an experiment we will be measuring the behavior of trust, whether you will be behaving in a trusting manner or not. So it's not just answers or attitudes, but it is behavior that is incentivized, where you will be getting a payoff at the end of the experiment. So you will be thinking very seriously about your decision and about your trusting behavior. Okay, so what is the trust game? In the trust game, the trustor can pass any amount of his endowment, okay, to the other person he is playing with. So he makes himself vulnerable by trusting the other person, whom we call the trustee. Okay? The amount passed, the amount that the trustor passes to the other person, will be multiplied by a factor, i.e., it could be doubled or it could be tripled The idea behind this doubling or tripling of the amount passed from the trustor to the trustee is to reflect the multiplier effect of trust on the economy. We mentioned before that trust is very important from an economic perspective. Okay, it leads to economic growth, for example. That's why the trust game, it has to reflect this importance of trusting others, okay, by multiplying the amount of money sent by the trustor to the trustee, okay, by a certain factor in order to reflect this importance of trust on the economy. The trustee, the other person, can then reciprocate the trust or not. Let's look at the instructions in the next slide in order to better understand what we mean by the trust game. So here are the instructions of the trust game in any economic experiment. Now consider yourself to be in the following situation with another person. Hence, there are two people in this game, person A and person B. So you know that you are playing this game with another person, okay? But you do not know who this person is. Here are the rules. Each person, A and B, receives 150 points to start with as an endowment. Person A can give away a share of his points to person B, between 0 and the 150 points that he has. The computer will then triple each point sent from person A, or double or whatever, it depends on the experiment, okay, and then give it to person B. Hence, if A gives 1 point to person B, this 1 point is tripled, okay, and B receives 3 points. Person B then can decide to return any number of points or all the points to person A. So these are the instructions of the trust game. And in some experiments, people like to put a figure like this in order to clarify the instructions. So again, according to this figure, there are two persons in the game, A and B. Each one is endowed with 150 points, okay? And person A is then asked to give any amount of points to person B if he likes. He can also choose 0, of course, okay? Any amount that he sends to person B will be tripled, as you can see on the figure, okay? And then B will be asked if he wants to return any amount of money to A. So as you can see, this game is trying to measure the trust level of A, whether A, who is the trustor, whether he will be trusting B or not by sending him some points from his, okay? And the other thing that is trying to measure is the trustworthiness of B, okay? The level of trustworthiness of B, and whether B will be respecting this trust or not, or whether he will be betraying this trust, okay? By asking him whether he wants to return any amount of money to A, okay? So in this example, according to this figure, for example, A decided to give 50 points from his to B, okay? So A is left with 100 points, okay? And B is now having 300 points, the 150 points that he was endowed with, plus the 150 points that he got from A after being tripled, okay? And from this example, B decided to return 40 points to A, okay? So these are the instructions related to the trust game. From these instructions, person A can give away 4 different amounts of points to person B. So he can decide to give him 0 points, which is a measure of non-trusting the other person, okay? Or he can decide to give him 50 points. He can decide to give him 100 points or 150 points. So he has 4 options to choose from, okay? And person B can then return any amount of points from 0 to all the points that he has to person A. So these are the two decisions that have to be taken in our trust game. So I'd like to note here that in some experiments, okay, the computer randomly chooses between person A and person B, which means that subjects enter into the lab and the computer randomly chooses which person will play the role of person A and which person will play the role of person B. So you might find yourself playing the role of person A, who has to either trust or do not trust the other person, okay, by being asked whether you want to send any amount of your points to the other person. And you might be chosen to be playing the role of person B, where you will only be responding to the level of trust of the other person in you, okay, which is a measure of the level of trustworthiness, whether you will be respecting this trust or you will be betraying this trust, okay. However, in other experiments, subjects will be asked to play the two roles, the role of person A and the role of person B, because in these experiments, the matching between the individuals will happen at the end of the experiment. So at the time when the subject takes the decision, he does not know how the other person has decided. That's why we call this a strategy method, because we will be asking each subject to play the two roles, once to be playing as A and once to be playing as B, as we will be seeing in the next slide. Now we will be looking at those types of experiments where the subject will be assuming the two roles, okay? So we will ask him, how many points do you want to send if you are person A? And he has to choose one of these four options. Either to choose the first option, which is 0 points, which means that this person will keep 150 points for himself and person B will be left with the 150 points of his endowment. Or he can choose to send 50 points, which means that he will keep 100 points as A and person B will now have 300 points after this 50 being tripled. Or he can decide to send him 100 points, which means that he keeps only 50 and leaves B with 450 points, or to send him 150 points, which means that he leaves nothing for himself and person B is now having 600 points. So these are the four options facing person A. And as you can see, the first option is a measure of 0 level of trust, okay? And 150 points is a measure of very high levels of trust. I'm trusting the other person to a high extent because I believe deep inside that he will be returning these points for me, for example. Now we will be seeing the decisions of person B, because as we said, in some experiments, the same person has to take the two roles as A and as B, okay? Why? Because although he knows that he is playing with another person, but he knows that the other person has not taken a decision yet. That's why we are asking him to decide as person B, okay, given all the possibilities that A might have taken. So in this case, we will ask him, how many points do you return if you are person B? The first scenario is if you have 150 points, which means that A has transferred 0 points to you, okay? In this case, we ask him, how many points would you like to send to the other person, okay? And he has to write it down. The other possibility is if person A has transferred 50 points to him, which means that B is now having 300 points. So he has to decide on how many points to return back to A, if any, okay? The third possibility is that A has transferred 100 points, which means that B now has 450 points. So he also has to decide on how many points he has to return back. And the last probability was that A might have transferred 150 points, which means that B now has 600 points. So again, this is called a strategy method. Why are we asking the subject to play the two roles? Because he is not matched yet with the other person. And this will keep reflecting the idea of trusting and trustworthiness. Why? Because we are asking him as A, how many points would you like to give to B? Okay, so here we are measuring his level of trust in B. Okay, and we are trusting his trustworthiness as person B. Okay, given the 4 possibilities that the other person might have taken, or the number of points that the other person might have sent him in the first phase. Okay, so this strategy method is a method that could be used in some experiments. But the other method is just for subjects to enter into the lab, and the computer randomly assigns them into person A or person B. And then we as analysts or economists, we just measure the level of trust of only persons A and the level of trustworthiness only of persons B. Now, after understanding the instructions of this game, what do you think will be the neoclassical prediction of individuals who play this game? According to the neoclassical assumptions, okay, their prediction would be that the trustor would keep his endowment and sends 0 points to the other person. This is the neoclassical prediction, because according to neoclassical economics, individuals are self-interested. So why should I send any amount of money to the other person? While knowing that, because they also assume that there is common knowledge, and I believe that the other person is also self-interested. So from a neoclassical perspective, they would say that any individual playing this game would send 0 to the other person because he knows that the other person is also self-interested, and if he sent him any amount of money, the other person will not return that money. So better send 0 from the beginning. So the pure strategy Nash equilibrium, according to the neoclassical economics or the neoclassical prediction, is that the trustor keeps his endowment and sends nothing to the other player. But what about the real world? What do you think will happen when this game is played in the real world? This graph shows us the distribution of the percentage of the endowment sent, okay, from players A, those who are sending, who are initiating the trust, who are sending money to the other persons. This is the result from real experiments. As you can see, 50% of persons A sent 15% of their endowment to the other person, okay, which is the highest bar in the middle, okay. This reflects that 50% of those who played as A, okay, they sent 0.15, which is 15% of their endowment to person B, which is of course in contradiction to the neoclassical prediction, because neoclassicals thought that individuals will be sending nothing, but in the real world, individuals sent 15% of their endowment to the other individual, which means that people trust others, okay? What about trustworthiness? According to this figure, again, the majority of players B returned around 15% of the points that they have to players A, which is a reflection of trustworthiness and non-betrayal of trust. and this is again what is happening in the real world. So this is again a contradiction of self-interested individuals a la neoclassicals. Okay, and that's why it is proven to be very important to try to measure the level of trust among individuals in different societies, in different countries. And that is what Mazen will be explaining to you in the next lecture on how Egyptians, on whether Egyptians trust each other or not, and what are the behavioral interventions that could result in higher levels of trust among Egyptians versus lower levels of trust among Egyptians. Why? Because, as we agreed, trust is a very important factor that affects economic growth, that affects political stability, that affects social exchanges and social transactions and marriages and friendships. So that's it for today's lecture, and I hope the next lecture, which will be an application to this game, will help you better understand this game and how it is used in experiments in the real world to solve or to try to better understand real world problems. Okay, hopefully this will help you in getting some ideas for your proposal as well. Bye.